grandfather was the Speaker of the House of Keys, oldest parliament in the world, lost all his money in a bank failure, and he decided, goodness knows why, to move to Canada. And one of the first, they settled in Toronto, and she described Toronto at that stage, and I'm not sure when it would have been. I would have said the early 20th century, like 19 whatever, but very, very early. And then they moved out to Alberta, and he got into politics there. I guess his political background in the Isle of Man sort of forced him into doing it again. And he became the Speaker of the first House of Legislature in Alberta. If you go to Edmonton and you go to the government, which is, and Edmonton is the head of the government, if you will, you'll see a picture there. The first Parliament of Alberta, which would have been in the very early 1900s, and there he is, the first Speaker. Sorry, not the first Speaker, I made a mistake. The first Clerk of the House. And that was a fairly important thing. But he was there when, Alberta was, you talk about cowboys and Indians, holy mackerel. It was pretty early Wild West in those days. My mother told me a story about when they first arrived in Calgary on the railway. They got off in Calgary, and there was the station, the railway station, and sitting outside the station was a First Nations woman with her baby. And I guess in those days they had little box cameras or something like that. Anyway, my mother went to take a picture of this Indian woman, and she picked up a handful of stones and threw them at my mother because they were superstitious about having their picture taken. They thought that it was, you were capturing their soul. And so that takes you back a long way in early Western history.
What was your mother's maiden name?
Cowell, Cowell.
And her dad's name was?
Cowell.
First name?
His first name was, I think it was Robert William. I looked him up on Google once, and yeah, there is a history about him. My cousin, who went over to the Isle of Man, went to the Parliament, the House of Keys, and actually spoke to one of the historians there, told her who she was, and who my grandfather was, and she said, "Oh, he's very famous." Now, this was in the early 2000s, and this woman remembered him, and he had left in the early 1900s. So he must have made some kind of a noise. Anyway, she said, "Oh, I've got something for you." She went to the archives, and she had a speech that was delivered by him to the Parliament. She gave it to her. Where that is right now, I have no idea. But I did see a speech that he had delivered in the Alberta government, and it must have been dated 1920 or something like that. And he had made quite a stupendous speech that was that made him really quite famous in Alberta. All about Alberta and Canada and all that stuff. My father was, I'm still trying to figure out when he was born. I would guess it was in the late 1800s, because he was in the First World War, and that was 1914. So he must have been old enough to be in the Army, oblique stroke Air Force, whatever. So I would guess it would be in the 1980s that he was born.
1880.
I mean 1880s, yes. But when he joined up, he was with, it seems to me that he told me that he went to a military college. I'm not sure that it was Sandhurst, but it was a military college, and he got his commission with the, what did they call it in those days? The British Expeditionary Forces. Because don't forget, at that time, England was an empire. They had holdings all across the world. India, the whole thing. He ended up in India. And he was a major in the 1st 5th Gurkha Rifles. Now, the Gurkhas were from Nepal, and they were the most loyal mercenaries to England. If England said do this, they'd do it. They were completely loyal to the British Crown. My father ended up, as I say, with as a major. He loved these people. They were little tiny guys. Like the average height for a Gurkha was 5 feet. They used to be in British military garb, except they never wore boots. They had bare feet, and their feet were like leather. My dad told me a story once about the English officers, Tata, were playing the Gurkhas a game of soccer. And of course, the officers all had boots on, and they were shod properly. The Gurkhas, on the other hand, had bare feet, and they beat the hell out of the Brits. He said that he's never met people that he loved more than the Gurkhas. He told me so many stories about, anecdotes about, as an officer and with the Gurkhas. He taught them how to sing English songs, like it's a long way to Tipperary. The Gurkhas didn't know what the hell they were singing, but they would mouth the thing. So they would be marching for miles and miles, singing "It's a long way to Tipperary." It's a long way to Tipperary. Didn't have a clue what they were talking about. The Gurkhas also carried into warfare, and as part of their everyday dress, a sword. Now, the sword was not like we think of a sword, which is like this long sort of thing. This was a shorter sword, and it was a battle sword, and it was called a kukri. And it was shaped like that, and it was razor sharp. They carried it wherever they went. When they killed a man in battle, they'd take off an ear. I mean, it was like you used to hear about the Indians here taking scalps if they killed somebody. Well, in those days, they would take an ear. And my father, as an officer, was able to have his own tent, but he also had a batman, what they called a batman. And one night he woke up, and the officers would have their armament in the tent with them. And one night he woke up to this horrifying scream, and he looked up, and his batman was in the tent with him, which is a no-no with a British officer. And he said, "What are you doing there?" And the man was putting something into a little bag they all carried in battle around their neck, like a little chamois bag or leather bag. And this man was putting something into his bag, and he said, "What are you doing?" And this man explained to him that he had wakened and heard something outside the tent. And he said, he finally explained to my father that he saw a hand coming in underneath the tent, going for my father's rifle. that was underneath his cot. So he just took out his kukri and went funk like this. And this guy went screaming off into the night without his hand. So that's what the man was putting into his bag, his trophy bag, was this poor so-and-so's hand. That was his trophy. And when my father first arrived on the scene and he was being told about these kukris, he was told that a kukri cannot be taken out of its scabbard and put back into its scabbard without blood being drawn. So the first thing he did, dummy, was when he was introduced to his Batman, he said, I'd like to see your kukri. Uh-oh. So the man handed him his kukri in the scabbard. My father immediately goes shunk like this and whips the kukri out of its scabbard, and this poor guy is going, oh no, please no. And so he said, oh, that's very interesting. He went to put the thing back into the scabbard, and the Batman pulled it out of his hand and cut himself with it. It had to have blood. So he cut himself with the kukri to be put back into the scabbard. So you know what, that the Gurkhas have a band. And they play in England all the time. They are the only mercenary force that's allowed at Buckingham Palace. And they're part of the guard of Buckingham Palace, completely loyal to England. And the poor guys, you know, some of them go back like a long time, and they're living on a pittance now. My father was, as I say, with the Gurkhas, and they were fighting the Turks. A warfare that actually took him to Gallipoli, which is another story, terrible story. But my dad was, I guess I don't know where the heck he was, but there was a raging battle going on. And my father was on the front line. He had a messenger on one hand and a machine gunner on the other, and then it went from there like down the line. So there were like hundreds of soldiers fighting the, I guess, Turks. And my father suddenly realized that they were being overwhelmed by the enemy. So he called to his messenger to go back to headquarters to bring up reinforcements. Messenger was dead, lying there. So he called to his machine gunner, drop the machine gun and get back there. We need help. Machine gunner's dead. And there's a long distance between him and the next person. And at that stage, he felt a hand on his shoulder, a really strong, heavy hand on his shoulder. And he thought, oh, thank God, there's reinforcements have come. He turned around, there wasn't a soul there. Now, eventually, they were obviously helped, and they got away from the danger that they were in. Now, the interesting thing is that in those days, it would take a month and a half for news to come between England and where they were. And he didn't realize it at the time, but I guess his mother was a psychic. She was into the whole ESP thing. And I must tell you, to make this story work, my father's father died when my father was about 3. Okay, so he never really knew him. And he felt this hand. A month later, a letter arrives from England, from his mother, and she described the battle in detail. She described the fact that the men on either side of him had been killed. He was all alone in this battle. And she said, you felt a hand on your shoulder, she said that was your father. And I mean, it stuck with him all those years, and I get it today, so many years later, and I still think, my God, you know, we don't have all the answers to all that psychic stuff, and you know, there is life out there, and we don't have an answer for it all. But I guess my grandmother was into that whole series of things, you know, that whole psychic thing. My father had one sibling, a sister, and she never came over here. She was in England, and she was a school teacher for the London County Council schools, which is, I mean, they looked after the education of the poorest kids you can imagine. And during the Second World War, she, like so many other teachers, had to get out of London because London was having the poo-poo kicked out of it by the Germans, the Blitz. And what they did in those days was they took all the school children, they took them to the seacoast or out into the countryside to get them away from London because they'd never make it. And my aunt, God, it's hard to say that she's my aunt, went down to the seacoast, and I can't remember where in England, but it was beaches and ocean and fresh air and all that stuff. And these poor little kids hadn't had fresh air in all their lives. So they used to go out on the beach, huge beaches, and they'd play in the fresh, lovely salt air and what have you. And one day, she had all her class out there, I don't know how many kids, 30, let's say 30 kids, and they're all playing. And a Messerschmitt, a German Luftwaffe Messerschmitt came down. And strafed them, killed them all.
Her too?
No. She escaped, and maybe 2 or 3 other kids escaped. All the others were blown off the beach.
Wow.
And it made her slightly crazy, which you can expect. It would have me too. But after, you know, hearing it third hand, it's still, I find it very emotional. Mm-hmm. But that was part of the Second World War. You couldn't.
First World War.
No, this is the second. This is the Second World War. My father, while he started with in the army, ended up with what was then known as the Royal Flying Corps, which is now the RAF. And they flew planes that God knows how they took off, how they stuck together. They were held together with duct tape and wire. And some of the stories he told were pretty amazing. He was stationed at one stage in the game in what was called then Mesopotamia, which is now Iran. And I mean, I've got photographs somewhere in one of the cupboards of those days, with the hanging gardens of Babylon and places, you know, that have long gone. I tried to get more of his history because, you know, every once in a while he'd tell me these stories, but he was reticent about talking too much about it. And I found out since that most people from the First World War are the same way. They don't want to talk about it. It was too awful. So I got in touch with the army in England. This is not that long ago, a few years ago. And I explained everything that I knew, the fact that he was an officer and the 1st, 5th Gurkha Rifles, and They had no record of him. And I went, wait a minute, hang on here. He didn't make this stuff up. So I thought, all right, I'll go to the Royal Flying Corps. Well, the Royal Flying Corps is, as I say, the RAF. And I said, I have a framed citation signed by Sir Winston Churchill, who was, what was he, the Minister of War or something at that particular time. And this thing was a citation for valor, and all that good stuff. They had no record of him. He was a flight lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps, and they had no record of him. And I think, what the hell, is my father a ghost or something? What is going on? And I have never been able to verify his situations in either of the armed forces. So what I'm telling you is what I've heard. Whether it's factual or not, I can't tell you. I went through the normal public school education. And I finally ended up actually going to high school at age 13, which I guess in those days was pretty young. But I got in there and I was a terrible student. Oh my God. I was the bane of the existence of all the teachers. There were a couple of teachers who liked me because they saw that I had some kind of artistic ability. The interesting thing was that my art teacher also taught, in those days, Latin. Now, I wasn't going to be a doctor, but she used to, we had to learn Latin. And I remember an open house at the school, and my father, this very proper little English gentleman, with his little three-piece suit, and he came to see his son at the open house. And it also gave him a chance of meeting the art teacher, who was a prissy little old biddy. That was very good, Peter. You were going to call her something else. But she was a real little pince nose sort of thing, and a little tailored suit. And so she was my art teacher. And so my father, in a very genteel way, said, and how is Peter doing with his art? Oh, she said, he'll never be an artist. He has no artistic ability at all. And he said something to her that I thought, okay, you've just finished my schooling, because I will be out tomorrow. He said, you silly bitch. He said, you wouldn't know good art if you found it in your soup. And with that, he turned tail in his little three-piece suit and walked out. And I'm going, excuse me, hello, Dad. I'm dead. And that was in first year high school. I made it to second year. And then they suggested that maybe it would be a good idea if I was to go to a school where they taught art. So they kicked me out. So I had 2 years of high school. And then I went to what they called a technical school in Toronto, Western Tech. And there you had the basic schooling, reading, writing, arithmetic, and you had art as well. And so that worked all right. And I had a couple of years of that, and then they kicked me out of that. And that's when I decided maybe we should go to a proper art school. So I went to the Ontario College of Art, and that's where I finished my art education. And that was fine. And from there on, I went into the advertising business. And I guess that was basically my education. My first job was working for a company, strangely enough, that my father worked for. And I was doing what they call storyboards for a film company. The film company was out in what we used to be known as Long Branch, way out the west end of Toronto, and it was a film company was trying to make it and wasn't doing a very good job. Anyway, my job was to do storyboards for them, and that was fine. And then they went up, belly up, and I ended up working for this company downtown. And then the phone rang one day, and it was a buddy of mine who was working for the biggest advertising agency in Canada. And he said, "Are you still looking for a job in advertising?" And I said, "Oh yeah, am I wanting to breathe?" And he said, "There's a job open. Here's who you see." I went over that afternoon. I had a little portfolio of stuff that I had done. They hired me that afternoon. And that was McLaren Advertising. And I was there for years and years. I started off as a junior layout artist. And then I finally became an art director. And then I finally became a creative director, a group creative director, which meant that I had other artists and I had writers working for me. And I was sort of overseeing what they did, what their product was. And that was good. And then my career proceeded to another agency and to another agency. I finally ended up out here in Vancouver, working, strangely enough, for the same company that I left in Vancouver, or in Toronto, I should say. And that's where I finished my career, was out here. In the meantime, I had done some things that I was pleased with. I did all the television advertising for Petro-Canada. When Calgary was doing the Winter Olympics, I did all the television promotion for that. Before there was they did the Olympic torch run across Canada. And so we actually made up what we thought that run would look like. And we took over a town in Quebec and had all the townspeople out there on the side of the road as the Olympic torch came by. And yeah, it was pretty great. And we had a cameraman from the United States shooting this thing, and he was down at the end of the street, and the street sort of ran up a hill into the village. And here are all the people on the side. And down the hill comes the runner with the torch, a made-up torch, and other people, support runners. And they were coming down towards the camera. And it was a test. It was just strictly a test. So they came down, they stopped. And I looked at the cameraman and I said, "Did I get you? Did you get that?" And he said, "No, I was crying." I said, "Hang on. Perhaps you should wipe those away and we'll do this again." So he finally got it. But yeah, there were some interesting things. But I was, as I say, I ended my career out here and then went from sort of, if you will, commercial art into fine art, and that's where I am now.